start again.
Hello to everyone that's here to participate in this Red Center Conference. I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here and tell you about an amazing woman that I became acquainted with. Upon our retirement, we decided to serve a mission as a husband and wife couple, and we started researching mission opportunities that would be available for a retired couple. A friend told us about a marvelous work service mission located in Bluff, Utah. And so we made the necessary preparations and packed our covered wagon, also known as U-Haul, and headed to Bluff. As we toured the fort grounds there, we were thrilled with the features that were there that had been erected by the descendants of the Hole in the Rock pioneers. And we were now excited with the opportunity we had to be able to share their story. After a busy training week with all of our fellow missionaries, we were excited to dive into the new assignments we had been given. There were 13 full-time retired couples and 3 part-time couples that were working there with us. And we all joined together to tell the Hole in the Rock experience. One morning, as we were about 3 weeks into the mission, working hard, as you can see, I was called into the director's office, and they asked me if I would take on a special project for the fort. They handed me a large 4-inch thick, 17 by 11 size family history ledger that had been donated to the Hole in the Rock Foundation to help further the story of those fantastic Hole in the Rock pioneers. I was asked to prepare a book that could be sold in the fort gift shop, telling the story of Jody Wood, who was one of the pioneers that settled in Bluff. I was nervous but eager to begin this project, so I jumped in feet first. All the questions I asked up front about legal rights and who the publisher should be, I was told just start the project and things will work out. This is Jody Wood. Her full name is Josephine Catherine Chatterley Wood. She was born to faithful parents who came to the United States from England. Her mother, by the time she came here, was a widow. And when she arrived in Salt Lake City, she met a gentleman who was also from England, and they married. And these were Jody's parents, and they settled in Cedar City, Utah, the Iron Mission. Jody's father was killed accidentally by a gunshot wound 3 days before her birth. And so her mother had 5 other children and Jody. It was a hard time to be raising a family as a widow. During the summer of 1855, crickets had nearly devastated the nearby fields and nobody had enough to eat. Catherine, her mother, lived 1 more year and she died in 1856, leaving Jody an orphan at age 3. So Jody's half-sister stepped in to raise her. She was raised in a home of love, hard work, and high expectations. Also living in Cedar City was a gentleman by the name of Samuel Wood. He was 10 years older than Jody. He worked as a freighter and a mail carrier. He also came from a line of faithful ancestors who had come from England. I wish there were time to share their stories. They were amazing people, both families. They went through so much to have a better life in America. Jody and Sam became acquainted over the years that they lived in Cedar City. And when Jody was 18 years of age, Samuel asked her to marry him. They were married in Salt Lake City and made their home in Cedar City. They had a beautiful home, It was a 2-story brick home with 6 rooms and was one of the finest homes in Cedar City at the time. Samuel worked very hard and was away much of the time on the freight road, but they still entered into the social and religious life of the community. Jody was very compassionate and kind, and people always came to her door. One night when Samuel was away, Jody was in her home alone, and she heard a knock at the door. As she opened it a crack, a wild man pushed in through the door and ran over to the fireplace. Jody was frightened as she looked at him, and he could tell this. He turned and told her, "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. I am freezing and starving." Immediately, Jody's fear left, and she prepared the man some food, gave him some warm blankets, and told him he could sleep by her fire. She went to sleep herself, and when she awakened the next morning, she found the gentleman had left. She didn't know his name or where he came from, but months later, she received a gift with this message: "From the man you kept from freezing and starving." Jody and Samuel spent most of their lives among family and friends in Cedar City and were so happy and content. But when rumors of resettlement came in the fall of 1878, they had been married nearly 7 years. They had already laid one son to rest. Their firstborn son was buried in the Cedar City Cemetery at only 18 months old. They had had 2 other little boys, and Jody was now expecting their 4th child sometime in June of 1879. Samuel went to the church meeting in March of 1879, where the calls to the San Juan mission were issued, authorized by John Taylor, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Jody couldn't bear to go with him to the meeting that day. She waited at home while everyone crowded into the meeting house to hear the news. Soon her half-sister came running out, and reaching Jody, she cried, "Oh, Josephine, you are called, but surely you won't go." As they wept together, Samuel joined them and said, "We are among those called, and we will go." Ever obedient to the call of their prophet, they began to convert their home and their belongings into teams and wagons and equipment that would get them through the long, hard journey. This took time, and as they proceeded, they had another child born, a young man, John Morton. Just 9 months later, Jody gave birth to another child, their 5th and their first daughter, in March of 1880. But she only lived for 16 months and was also buried in the cemetery in Cedar City alongside her brother. You can understand that with these 2 incidences in their life, it slowed down their preparations for the journey. But they continued their preparations, sold their home and their land and their belongings. They realized little for their property, but telling about it with good humor, Jody said, "Sam traded the home and land for teams and wagons and just a few sacks of bran." And in the same humor, Sam countered, "Yes, and Josephine gave the bran to the neighbors to feed their hungry pigs." The hardest part of leaving their home there was the 2 little graves in the cemetery that they left behind. They left on October 17th, 1882, 3 years from the date that the previous company had gone through the notorious hole in the rock of the Colorado. There was a very small company traveling with them, only 5 families out of 21 that had been called for this second group. Hiram Perkins had been sent from Bluff to help guide them through the treacherous journey. Jody recorded in her journal on October 18th, "Started today from Johnson's Fort with great sorrow and weeping, parting with all our friends and dear relatives. Went on a mile or 2. There we met Bishop Arthur and some friends, but that was our last Cedar folks for that day. Then we had nothing to do but lay back in our wagons and think of those we had left and their kindness. We arrived in Parowan Lane about 5 o'clock and camped early to turn the stock in the field. The children and their mamas are all crying to go back. It's a great trial for me to leave Cedar. This little band of pioneers had to build their roads as they went. They had fewer men and less equipment than the first company had. They traveled uphill in deep sand, through narrow twisting canyons, over slick and dangerous rock surfaces, and often camped without water. The cattle got lost. The wind blew until they could scarcely breathe for the dust in their faces. They frequently had to turn back and find lost stock, and then the men would have to stand guard over them at night lest they turn back again. Sometimes the men would gather around the fire, then stretch out on the ground, wrapping themselves in either blankets or hides. Daybreak would find the camp astir and everyone preparing for the next day's move. Sometimes snow sifted down from the skies, occasionally just a light sifting. Sometimes they were in the midst of a howling blizzard. They often moved at a snail's pace, squeezing through canyon walls so tight that the wooden boxes of the wagons were scratched and scarred. They were going to enter the San Juan area through an area which came to be known as the back door of the San Juan, through sheer bluffs thousands of feet high and ledges of awe-inspiring size that had been cut by the great Colorado River. On October 30th, Jody wrote in her journal, quote, "All well in health, but the life was frightened right out of us all. I don't know what they call this place, but I call it the Devil's Twist, and that is a Sunday name for it. For of all the roads on earth, I don't think there is any worse than they are here. It is no earthly use for me to try to describe the road or the country. It is the most God-forsaken and wild-looking country that was ever traveled. Well, we hardly get started before some of the men have to double up. It is mostly all uphill and sand knee-deep, and then sheets of solid rocks for our poor animals to pull over and slide down. I never saw poor animals pull and paw as they have done today. We don't stop for dinner. The poor horses haven't had a drink today, and they're almost given out. It will be late before we get into camp. The women and children have done a good deal of walking and pushing on the wheels. Oh, of all roads, and the wind is blowing terrible. We can hardly see, and if you open your mouth, you're sure to get it filled. Well, we finally get into camp, and all the children are crying for a drink, and with the cold, the men went out and found a tank. If it was not for these beautiful tanks, the poor travelers would suffer, if not die. The men get back, and the dear children get a drink. But we are very saving. We can't wash our dishes again tonight. This is a sample of the tanks that Jody talked about in her journal. They were potholes in the sandstone, erosions in the sandstone that filled with rainwater, and these became lifesavers for all of the travelers in those days. Even though sometimes when they awoke in the morning, they would find dead animals in the tanks. On November 2nd, Jody wrote, "Travel over rock that no human being should ever try to go over, but we keep going until we come to the dreaded Colorado River." They had finally come to Hall's Crossing, where Charles Hall had brought in logs, plants, and pitch from Escalante to make a crude tapered boat. There was no cable that guided this raft. It was towed upstream and shoved off with the payload. One man would steer and two would paddle as the boat ferry floated downstream, angling towards the other side of the river. Of this experience on November 4th, as they crossed, Jody had written, "Now it is our turn. Oh, pray for us." The raft was pushed up on the bank part way. Brother Fred Jones was driving. My children and I were in the wagon. We drove onto this raft, and the wagon was securely tied to it with ropes. The men started to rowing, and down the raft went, and all went into the water with a splash. My heart went faint. I went blind and clung to my babies. I shall never forget my feeling as we went down into the water and my fear of the wagon going off into the swift flowing water. Before we started, I asked Fred to nail the cover down on all sides so that if we were drowned, we would all go together, and he did. When the treacherous river was safely crossed, we did thank our Heavenly Father. We stayed here for 2.5 days while the men got the cattle across. The cattle would get in the water and they would swim to the opposite side, one cow leading the rest. The men were in the water all day and were wet and cold, yelling until their throats were sore, trying to get them across. We washed, cooked, bathed, and had all the water we wanted to drink. The children were happy, and we were happier than we had been since we left home. We had shade, and there was good feed for our horses. The mountains here are all colors and very beautiful. I'll skip over the details of the remaining hardships on their journey, but trust that they were difficult. They still had to go through Castle Wash, Clay Hill Pass, Grand Gulch, Comb Wash, and Comb Ridge. But I do want to share Jody's sentiment on one of her November entries when she described the dangerous efforts required to traverse a steep hill. Yet, despite the danger and the back-breaking labor, she was optimistic and grateful. Quote, "We have been walking most of the way for 2 days. This is just as hard on the women and children as it is on the men and horses. Backs were made for the burden, or ours would have been broken long ago. I guess things could be worse. We are all alive and well, and the sun is shining." And when they finally pulled into the flat river bottoms of Bluff, her little journal read, "We are happy to get to Bluff. Our horses are tired out, so are we, but we got here alive. The Lord was surely with us." There they moved into the cramped quarters of a little one-room cabin in the primitive fort. They were far from 100 miles from any place where white people lived. On the south across the river was the hostile nation of Navajos. On the north and all around them was the even more quarrelsome and disagreeable Paiutes. They stayed in this fort until 1883 or 1884, and then began moving out to build on their assigned lots. Samuel was a carpenter, and he built them a little log cabin on a hill just a block west of the fort. Little could be built from the twisted and the crooked cottonwood trees that grew along the river. Years later, Samuel added another room about 12 feet long, and later still another one with board walls and floors. This was the Wood family home for the 25 years that they remained in Bluff. After some time, though, the little log home was quite livable. They whitened the walls with lime, and the floors were scrubbed with homemade soap. If a rug or carpet covered the floor, it was one made out of worn-out clothing. Beds were constructed of slats and great ticks that they filled with clean straw each fall. The good warm quilts were thick and homemade, and every bed had 2 or 3. The pillows were stuffed with straw also. Samuel developed a beautiful orchard. In time, he had cows and honeybees. With all the others struggling to build the community, the Woods shared their produce, time, and means. All had faith they had been called by proper authorities, so they worked unitedly for peace among themselves and to convince the Indians that they were friends. In 1884, the Wood family returned to Cedar City once again on another challenging trip because Jody was 5 or 6 months pregnant, depending on the exact date of their leave taking. And she wanted to have the care of her half-sister, Mary Ann, who had delivered all of her other babies. Jody did not keep a journal on this trip. I can't even imagine the challenge of riding back along this same route when you are 5 or 6 or 7 months pregnant in a bumpy, old covered wagon. But they did get back to Cedar City, and their child was delivered under the care of her half-sister. Baby George William, whom they called Bud throughout the rest of his life, was added to the family. And they spent time with their loved ones in Cedar City and then returned to Bluff. The company that they returned with was a very small one. There were only 3 men, 4 women, and 8 small children. This is a picture of one of the areas that they came through, Grand Gulch, and they also traversed through Capitol Gorge. Jody called it the Cliffs of Hell. I won't take time to quote from her journal on this trip about the challenges that they all faced, but Jody did keep journal entries of this return trip to Bluff. I want to share one entry from December 10th. We reach our last grand camping ground before we cross the Great Colorado, 24 days from home, and we thought we'd be nearly to Bluff by now. The children are crying and we have to bake for supper with sad hearts at the thought of getting up the mountain before us and then the dreaded river. Oh dear, would anybody on earth travel over such roads? None but Mormons. But the sun is shining. Mr. Lyman is the boss of the boat here, and he's with us tonight. He came to get his pay. I told him the man that picked out such a road and said it was good enough for white men to travel on ought to be hung to the first tree that was large enough, and I would help pull on the rope. But as he said, the Lord made man the stronger and women's tongues the longer, and he wouldn't stop to argue. The next morning she wrote, all well today with the old boatman collecting his pay. Breakfast is ready, and we ask him to eat with us. He is very kind. He says he has never had a woman talk to him for 15 years, so I have kept it a-going. They eventually get back to Bluff and settle into the community again. They were aware that the San Juan River had nearly flooded, ending their missionary effort in Bluff. In such a remote place, disaster could come quickly and unexpectedly. Jody is now 33 years old and has 5 living children, her husband, and plenty of hard work ahead. This picture was taken in about 1892, which was a few years after they came back from that return trip, and she had some additional children by then. This is the only family photograph, though, of the Wood family. Pioneer life was extremely difficult. There was wood to gather, water to haul, gardens to plant and later harvest, cattle and horses to care for, cows to milk, butter to churn, clothes to wash, a house and furniture to build and care for, and a living to earn. There was little time for rest. Every season brought its own workload. But there was also sociability, square dances, corn huskings, and Sunday meetings. There was not a home where more parties or candy pulls and quiltings and children's gatherings were held than at Sam and Jody Wood's. Jody often told her children, I would be ashamed of a son or daughter who would turn anyone away who is hungry. She also said, a crust of bread and a welcome is more appreciated than a banquet given grudgingly. People love to visit their home and share in their warmth and hospitality. Jody had a special way with the sick, the hurt, or the ailing, but now this gift was put to the test as Jens Nielsen, who was the Bishop of Bluff, called Jody to serve as the doctor and midwife for the little community. As the mother of 5 children, including a new baby and many problems of her own, She shuddered when she heard his request. She said, "I am as green as a cucumber, and I don't even know how babies are born." But with the encouragement of Sam and her family to pitch in, Jody accepted this call as she had other difficult calls in her life, with a firm belief that she must do what was required of her. Bishop Nielsen placed his hands on her head and gave her a special blessing. In his prayer, he said she would be guided by the Lord and great wisdom would be hers. She was set apart and sustained as with any other calling in the church. But knowing that faith without works is dead, Jody bought every book she could on the subject of medicine. First aid, obstetrics, internal discomforts, injuries. She relied on her education and especially upon the Lord at every turn. The Woods were a family that spread compassion and love to all. They had been involved in many of the joys and sorrows of their little community before, but now that Jody was going to serve as the doctor and midwife, they would be involved in everything that took place. When her first delivery call came, she was afraid. Samuel placed his hands upon her head to invoke the Lord's blessing upon her as she cared for the sick, and he asked the Lord to guide her. On this particular first occasion, Jody asked Bishop Nielsen to go with her. As the confinement progressed, the cord was wrapped around the baby's neck. Jody later said that someone spoke to her, telling her exactly what to do. She had been promised she would be directed by the Holy Spirit. She removed the cord and saved the little one's life. Afterwards, she said, quote, "I thought Bishop Nielsen had spoken to me, but when I turned to look at him, he was not in the room. I knew that the Lord had blessed me, telling me plainly what to do." This particular little baby, the daughter of Joseph F. and Harriet Ann Barton, was appropriately named Josephine. From this point on, Aunt Jody, as she was endearingly called, became the beloved figure of San Juan to every stranger, Indian, and white alike. Everyone felt they had a claim on her when something went wrong. She could be seen in the early morning or the middle of the night, in the heat of the day, walking hurriedly through the streets to some home. The children began to believe that Aunt Jody brought the little babies in her small black bag. She answered every call of distress, regardless of the hour. Over the years until 1908, Jody recorded 165 births in her journal. Her family believes there were many more. She didn't start recording right at the beginning, and many of her journal pages were lost. Carolyn Nielsen Redd of Bluff wrote of Aunt Jody, quote, "She took care of me when 8 of my children were born. Sometimes she brought Aunt Mary Jones with her, and when these 2 good women entered my home, all fear left, and I knew everything would be all right. To have Aunt Jody near was worth more than medicine. Her tender touch, encouraging words, calm spirit, cheerful way, and prayers were many times the only medicine needed. If there is such a thing as perfection on this earth, Aunt Jody can be counted as such. To know her was to love her." The stories about Jody's doctoring are many, and several are told in the book. She even helped save the life of a cow, as all the men were out of town and the family sent for her to come. She went and poured soda water down the cow's throat and saved its life. During these years of Jody's life, she also happened to give birth to 3 more children, all girls. This is a picture of Jody's 4 daughters. On May 20th, 1884, before she even became the nurse midwife of Bluff, Jody was also asked to serve as the president of the primary association of her church in Bluff. She served in that capacity for 24 years. The primary is an organization that teaches children ages 3 to 12. Jody and her counselors had to develop their own lessons because there were no lesson manuals back in those days. Over the years, they had many wonderful times together, many primary parties and socials. Quoting from the life story of Sarah Jane Wood Broadbent, May Day, the 1st of May, was the first day of spring and was as wonderful as Christmas. Father would take the wagon and fill it with youngsters, some mothers, some pans and baskets filled with picnic lunches, and off we would go to Cow Canyon. Games, races, and climbing to the caves and the picnics made an event to be remembered. There was a cave in this canyon that was filled with pink and blue forget-me-nots. The children would all climb to the cave, gather these flowers, and weave a crown, and crown my mother, Josephine Catherine Wood, the president of the primary, the Queen of the May. Years later, the following tribute was written by Mary Lyman Reeve, dated October 10th, 1947. Aunt Jody was the president of our primary in the early days of Bluff. We loved her beyond words to express. Many of the valuable lessons we learned in life were instilled into us in our early years under her tutelage. It is fortunate for us that we had been taught to worship God, or we would have spontaneously worshiped Aunt Jody. Somehow Jody found time to care for her family, plant a flower or two, enjoy the cultural, religious, and social activities in her community. She became great friends with the Indians and added them to her doctoring schedule. Her experiences with them would make a story in and of itself, and several experiences are shared in the book, Jody's Journal. One day when Jody was home alone, Posey, the Paiute who often caused trouble, walked in waving his gun at her in a very threatening way. He demanded food. Posey could be quite ugly enough when he was sober, but now he was inflamed with some kind of firewater. He was a wild man, fearsome to see and to hear. Jody happened to have no bread or drink in the house, but she at once decided what she could do to confront this situation. She had her wondrous self-control. So she walked boldly forward and took the gun from Posey and told him to take a seat. She then prepared him some hot biscuits and a pot of hot coffee. Hot bread and coffee were chief items in the Indian diet, and the Wood family kept it on hand for such emergencies. During the delay in the preparation of the meal, Posey sat as commanded, but like the little whipped dog that still dares to bark under his breath, he grumbled and swore, saying, "Hurry up, white squaw, heap slow." When he had devoured a lot of the buttered biscuits and washed them down with big cups of coffee, he sobered somewhat and asked for his gun back. "No," Jody affirmed, asserting her courage. "You go home and sleep, and when you come back a good Indian, you can have the gun." He returned the next day, stuck his head rather hesitantly through her doorway, and declared, "Me now good Injun, my gun me want 'em." He got the gun, and with it a solemn order to never come there again when he was drunk, and he never did. The Woods had so much love and empathy for people who were in sorrow. They knew how it felt, as they had lain 2 children to rest in the Cedar City Cemetery. Since Samuel was a carpenter, he built coffins when they were needed, and Jody trimmed them to make them as nice as possible for those who had passed. While Jody comforted others, she and her family went through many trials themselves. Death came to 3 more of their children, in addition to the 2 babies that were buried in Cedar City. This is 13-year-old John Morton, who died of an infection in his knee from blood poisoning. Jody had saved countless others, but she could do nothing to save him. He was the first of her children to be buried on the Bluff Hill in the Bluff Fort Cemetery. She wrote in her journal, quote, "He was the quickest one in our family to make it right. He would ask the youngest child forgiveness when he was shown he was wrong, and he was always willing to make everything right. And then he was so happy when he was doing something for others that he knew would please them. That was the happiest moments of his life. We did all in our power, we knew, for his relief, but nothing done him any good. There were several who came to see him. He suffered 18 long days and nights, and then although we could not give him up, he begged to go. The Lord that is wise in all things took him to himself with all our pleadings, but the Lord's will be done, not ours. I need not say it was a very severe trial on us all." Jody still carried on giving herself to help others. Then 8 years later, they lost their beautiful young daughter, Bernice. She was the last of 10 children born to Jody and Sam, and Jody had found extra joy in her presence. This little girl caught what seemed to be a cold. It quickly turned to a severe and sore and infected throat, and did not yield to the treatments that usually were effective before. Jody maintained an unbroken vigil day and night, but it was one of those baffling battles where man's most heroic efforts availed nothing. But the end was not in sight for them. In 1906, Jody and Samuel were asked to fulfill one more assignment, to move out of Bluff and assist the struggling young ward in Monticello. By now, they had been in Bluff 25 years and dearly loved the people, but they willingly uprooted themselves once more and gave the same kind of service that they had always given. They had moved to Monticello and been there 1 year when this son, George William, left to serve a church mission. He went to Texas and was there only 3 months, where he died of typhoid. Jody recorded, "George W. Wood, our youngest son, aged 22 years, left home well and in good faith of filling a mission. He traveled on to Texas, where he took sick and died there in Harold, Texas. He was brought home to Bluff for burial. My darling boy was laid away July 27th, 1907. Jody Wood loved the Lord, answered his call to serve others, and fulfilled that commission to her dying breath. Much can be learned from her example and her humility. I love the sentiment that she shared in her journal years earlier, after she had crossed yet one more river crossing. Quote, "Now we are over, and I thank our Heavenly Father for it. That is the best time we have ever crossed a river. I am nursing the baby, waiting for my wash water to get hot. The dear children are as happy as larks, and we are in a lovely place and so pleasant, the most pleasant evening we have had since we left home. So while I am waiting, I am riding safely on the other side. If, when we are through life's journey and are as safe on the other side and are as happy as we are tonight, I think I will be satisfied with my 5 little children that are with me here tonight and the dear ones that have already passed on the other side." Jody passed away on February 10th, 1909. Per her request, she was laid to rest on Bluff Cemetery Hill. It was just over a year later that Samuel followed her in death. But they were both present to welcome their youngest living daughter, Alice Charlotte, when she passed away later in 1918 during the great influenza epidemic. She had been living with her oldest sister, Jenny, in Heber. Like her mother, Jody, she had given her life nursing the people in Heber who were suffering from illness during that horrible epidemic from 1916 to 1918. And then she fell victim to it herself. So Jody's 4 remaining children, Joseph Henry, Arthur Stephen, Jenny, and Kate, lived long and productive lives, leaving Jody and Samuel with a posterity of 35 grandchildren, 115 great-grandchildren, and 318 great-great-grandchildren. In today's world, there's a great need for reminders of the lessons such as those taught by Jody's life story. It's good for us to be taken back to the earlier days and have our minds refocused on the struggles of those early pioneers that remind us of the necessity for labor, the need of service to bless others, and of the importance of faith in God if there's to be lasting achievement. I am so grateful for the lessons that I learned from Jody and Samuel Wood and their family while I prepared their story. When I jumped into this project, I had so many questions about contacting the Wood descendants for their legal authorizations and researching publishers. I had questions about getting the original photographs, and we were able to connect with the 93-year-old granddaughter of Jody Wood, who was living in Salt Lake. This is Catherine Hanson Marks. She gave her permission for us to proceed forward. She gave the original photographs. Some of them were very badly damaged, but miracle upon miracle happened as we set about preparing this book for publication. I learned much from this wonderful family, and I feel like they wanted their story to be shared. Many little miracles occurred. They may be small in comparison to Jesus raising the dead, but magnitude doesn't distinguish a miracle, only that it came from God. So Jody's journal was prepared, and here I am standing in front of the cabin that was erected in their honor. The descendants of Jody and Samuel graciously stepped up and paid for all printing costs and donated 3,000 books to the Bluff Fort for them to sell in the gift shop there. I am so thankful for the opportunity I had to learn from their experiences, from their descendants, and all the people who popped into this story right at the time it was needed. Thank you for your participation today. And in conclusion, my recommendation is that anyone watching this presentation, pack your wagon and head to Bluff Fort. It's a vacation experience that you'll treasure. Thank you.